Well, my job is to do a brief overview of the proposal that we've developed, Climate in Oregon's Industrial Forest, a Green New Deal proposal. I'm going to provide context, dig into a little of it, but I'm going to go fast and I don't want to run over my time. So here we go. The proposals for a discussion. That's a key thing to remember. The problem we're addressing is a dangerously warming climate. Real important to understand this proposal is how we processed on and were sensitive to the scale of the response needed. We relied on the policy framework of HR 109, the Green New Deal, House Resolution 109. And House Resolution 109 has a social grounding in just transition social equity. So as we developed this proposal, this kind of line of thinking influenced everything we researched and thought about and tried to solve in terms of a solution that we were seeking for the industrial forest lands relative to carbon sequestration. Everyone on here, I'm sure, is aware in terms of the scale of the problem we're facing. We're facing a potential global catastrophe. We mentioned in the document the statement by 11,000 scientists. This was their second warning letter. Both are referenced in the document with hot links if you have a PDF of the document. We take these very seriously. They informed and motivated us almost on the entire, all the elements we processed on. I wanted to note here real quick that going back to 1999, Coast Range produced a report called Forest at Work, a proposal for a new forestry dealing with the problem of investor-driven forestry. And we asked a simple question. The industry at that time was saying they grow forest to 45 years. We asked the question, what happens if you grow forest to 140 years? There's a long literature and history of the problem of why corporate owners, financial owners, business owners do not grow forests past 50 years, even though our study in 1999 demonstrated that you'd have more harvest per year, more income, more profit if you were a company. And that's what I had to work on for a number of years, the economics of why forests look the way they do out in the industrial estate, and the theme that you come across in the literature, in the forestry, capitalist considerations of return on equity don't work for forest, and it's the time value of money versus the ecological or growing time of real forest, particularly in the Pacific Northwest here. What we're talking about in our proposal are all the lands that are colored essentially red or purple in the map on the left. This is Western Oregon's land ownership map. Green and light green are public lands. If you look at this map, there's a couple of things that you can notice is that the gray area is land use for everything else. It's very small. The actual land that people could use in Western Oregon is, like living in Maryland. And I put a couple of red lines on that map that aren't in the original map. Below that red line or to the east of that red line are the dry forest, and they have a different ecology, a different fire ecology than everything north. These maps are available on the Coast Range website. They're downloadable as big PDF posters, and they're really worth taking a look at. We distinguish between the Real Estate Investment Trust, Timber Investment Management Organization, Redlands, and the more traditional industrial lands that are connected to mills in some way. There's the landscape. that we're addressing on the left there, it's actually the Millicoma Tree Farm, owned by Weyerhaeuser, where George Weyerhaeuser came down here in the 60s and announced that their 100-year rotation forestry regime on the big standing old growth they had acquired was going to be replaced by a fast-growing, shorter rotation regime, because it was around that time that the financial management of forests was ascendant and became dominant. And there was quite a bit of pushback by the local managers and such in Weyerhaeuser, Coos Bay at the time. Here's a slide that illustrates what this half of what this proposal is about. On the right are the current industrial lands. They have somewhere in the range of 113 tons of carbon per acre on them in live biomass, And on the left are the original forests that were here before the industrial owners took over. And they average 323, 300. So we have a huge carbon debt from the loss of the native forest that was on the industrial lands. And it's around maybe 600 million tons of carbon have gone into the atmosphere from this loss of forest. And the proposal is to recover and set on a trajectory, recovering the carbon on the industrial lands that the financial owners cannot do. This is right out of our proposal document. Since the 1980s, when forest owners, the corporate forest owners were integrated large companies with the workers working for the companies, many of them unionized. Today, what we have is a very lean, small corporate management company. They either own the forest or they manage the forest on behalf of investors, and then hundreds of contractors that actually do the work of hauling, logging, reforestation. And so this huge transition in the structure of forestry has exacerbated many social problems that always have been out in the woods, but now workers are isolated in small contractor organizations and deunionized. This has had a huge impact on the nature of work and how people are compensated, etc. It's real important to appreciate how this structure has evolved over the past 30 years. The other thing we were very sensitive to in this analysis, besides the pressure on workers in the timber industry and contractors, is the conditions out in the landscape. We accessed an analysis that looked at what they call asset limited, income constrained, and employed people. You've got people that live in poverty out in the rural landscape, just as you do in the city. But what's interesting about ALICE households is that they're basically people who are working, but they have hardly any assets, and it's paycheck to paycheck existence. And so the report looked at specific census districts, areas for all the counties in Western Oregon. And these are some of the numbers that you see just in Tillamook County. And there's numbers for all the counties. But in Garibaldi CDP, which is a census designated place, Bayside, or I should say Garibaldi, you've got 57% of households that are either in poverty or living paycheck to paycheck. Idaville, 70%. Pacific City, 58%. Tillamook City, 55. Wheeler, 66. In the areas that have lower, I should say, not low, Hebo, 28%, Nehalem, 33. Those are all areas that are residential retirement areas for people from the more affluent metro areas. So when you really have a a rural landscape that's dependent on the local organic economy, you have these high rates of people who are just living hand to mouth or in poverty. And this is a dramatic picture of the rural landscape that our proposal was sensitive to, as it should be, based on the Green New Deal's mandate for just transition. So this is the summary of the timber industry situation out on the industrial landscape. The real estate investment trust owners dominate the land. The reason they're REITs is because that allows them to pay no income tax as a company. The money goes right through to investors who then only pay at 15 to 20% capital gains. Low property taxes. $120 million a year less in taxes are being paid by the timber industry, the industrials, than in 1990 in constant dollars. Lost production, something we continually bring up about financial rotations, is that when you do a financial rotation, you lose 20 to 50% of saw timber production. The ecological damage, it's too numerous to even list in this or even talk about here. Many other groups do that and do it well. Damaged communities, depopulation, lost economies. Those depopulation is a theme in the Green New Deal to be sensitive to. And an exploited workforce, as I alluded to earlier, from this transition in the nature of work and the firms you work for. So these are Oregon's financial forests. Bottom line is, the financial forest management grows dollars, not forests. And that is what the whole place is about under this new corporate regime, financial forestry. So the question is, where do the dollars go? It's not like they're giving the trees away. They're having some pretty significant sales, particularly today. If you've been in buying any lumber, they're making a killing. And so this is what, these numbers here are really what I could say drive me nuts, is that this entire landscape, financially managed, generating a large surplus, a large basis of income. And I'm not just talking profits here. I'm talking payments to investors, bondholders, shareholders, owners, banks, the investor class that owns all this stuff. We do know that 60% of equities in the United States are owned by the top 1% richest households in the United States and 90% by the top 10%. In fact, these numbers are understated because we have whole swaths of forest here that are owned by billionaire families. All this is the generic equity ownership in the flow of money in the United States. All the while, the purpose and the cash flow off these lands going to the richest households in the United States, they engage in massive externalized cost to society and ecological damage, failure to pay proper taxes, etc., homelessness and other outcomes of poor public services. And so I think there's a fairly damning indictment of what Wall Street's colonization of Western Oregon is all about. The fact that it is lacking in carbon and then has this social condition, it resonated, all these facts resonated deeply with us when we read the Green New Deal. So bottom line is, and I've used this in many of my presentations, and I thought I might as well throw it in tonight, is that outside of Western Oregon and outside the forest issue, what we have in the United States now under this 40-year neoliberal regime that pretty much dominates everything in a deregulated system is you have a system at the top, owners of capital, basically vacuum cleaning the cash out of people's pockets in every which way they can think of, deunionization, whatever. And then what do they do with this massive amount of cash they have? They sell it back to people as debt, student debt, whatever, credit card debt. And it's a nice little system for the 1% at the top, but it's not working for 60, 70% of the people in this country. The other theme is that we know about all these problems. We know about many of the themes that go on in the rural landscape or in the urban landscape. The scientists sent 11,000 letter warning us, the second warning, saying get ready. But for decades, literature in the United States and in the Western world and the movies have constantly played to dystopian themes. Science fiction has played the alien invasion. It's really all a metaphor about the invasion of capital and the destruction of communities. Whether it's Walmart destroying small towns across America, these themes are in front of us every day. And this is nothing unusual that I'm speaking about. It just happens to be the way it's playing out on industrial forest. And we could do themes in healthcare, higher education, student debt. You could do an equal presentation of how the system isn't working. And all that goes to the heart of how the Green New Deal would change much more than just climate and the transformation of our energy systems. So let's talk about what we propose here. After much thinking and grappling and floundering, we see land reform and social benefit enterprise as the essential Green New Deal appropriate solution for the industrial forest lands. For one, only with a social benefit enterprise and pulling these lands out of C Corp or REIT or whatever, can we sequester atmospheric carbon. And by having social benefit enterprise, we have just and equitable solutions that are multifaceted and possible. And this is all tied to a close reading of the Green New Deal HR 109 document and other documents. Land reform is really the heart of what we need here. Land reform is a movement around the world. Interestingly, it's not much of a movement, if at all, in the United States. And there's a reason for that. And it has a lot to do with oil and gas, the power of oil and gas industries, and other powerful industrial elites. We came across an article published in Dissent magazine, Levi Van Zandt, fall 2019, titled Land Reform and the Green New Deal. Few Green New Deal proposals include explicit attention to rural people and places. This is a criticism of the Green New Deal we've seen in other places. And Van Sant says, build solidarity with global climate justice and food sovereignty movements, such as La Via Campesina. A bold vision for rural America can build broader support for the Green New Deal and challenge the ascendance of right-wing populism. We see our proposal as an answer to timber unity. And the words that really matter in that sentence is it has to be a bold vision. This can't be milquetoast. It has to scale to the climate emergency, and it has to deal with real material conditions out in the landscape. And an interesting element in this article is the first National Conference on Land Reform held in San Francisco in April of 1973. There is a whole history of stillborn land reform movements in the United States that we need to further investigate and know our history much better. Perhaps that's a report for another moment. So then we saw that because of the nature of industrial forest firms, corporate financial firms, and the problem with growing larger forests, obviously we thought, well, we have to put them in some sort of social benefit enterprise entity. There's a lot of, we kind of bounced around like a ping pong ball on a lot of ideas and things. And then the idea hit. I, I lived on the coast. I still have property on the coast. And I got my telephone service from a telephone co-op, Pioneer Co-op. And I remember, yeah, of course, most people in the rural areas in Western Oregon and in the United States buy their electricity from electric co-ops. And co-ops actually are all over the rural landscape. And this is a little report from Oregon, actually in 2012. Last year, they probably had the money to do these kinds of reports, is that co-op utility, electric co-ops service over 200,000 households and businesses out in the rural lands. And municipal owned utilities are quite substantial. Eugene, eWeb down there, and people's utility districts, another municipal type utility set up during the New Deal, services all the coastal counties. So we have quite an extensive public benefit enterprises servicing the electric power and telephone grids out in the rural landscape. Portland, Salem, Corvallis, they are investor-owned utilities. And in the 2012 report by the state, it noted that investor-owned utilities pay 20 to customers more for electricity. It struck me that, here's the model, came out of the New Deal era, and it's perfectly amenable to new forms of ownership of land in the Green New Deal era that we need to have. We explored this, transferring land to social benefit enterprise. This diagram on the right is actually, and if you read the document, there's quite a bit of exploration on how cash flows. And here's just our little diagram that could show how cash flows in a co-op or whatever. And you could have employee profit sharing, but what goes out to investors today and banks and bondholders and all this cash that flows out could be reinvested also in building up the carbon in the forest, advancing rotation, and yet we could still keep whole the workforce. And under a Green New Deal and a jobs guarantee, we could probably increase the workforce outside of just the cash flow of the social benefit forest land owning entity. And it all made sense. It seemed, we've thought about it, we've run some numbers, we've looked at things in various lights. This seems to be a proposal that's worth considering. And who would use these models? Well, we see tribal land restoration as certainly a huge component of any land reform in Western Oregon. Small landowner restoration. There's been somewhere between 750,000 and 1 million acres of small landowner holdings absorbed by the industrials since the 1960s. Every time you lose a small household out in the landscape in a rural valley, maybe you're losing a small farming operation, you're losing someone who's productive, and that depopulates the rural landscape. Depopulation, deindustrialization, industrialization. These are all frontline community themes in HR 109. Worker and community co-ops, obviously, what this model would look like, but you could have municipal ownerships too. Many municipalities out there own their catchments for their drinking water, but many don't. And we could see Green New Deal financing assisting municipalities in buying key catchments and watersheds for drinking water quality. And there is the need for some conservancy restoration in crucial areas around Western Oregon that perhaps some of what we're proposing would be land purchase grants tied to working forest conservation easements. It's the working forest conservation easement that would set the tone of how much carbon buildup and how forest management would go forward. That would be your guarantee. So our next steps are is to appreciate this is a proposal for discussion. We're sharing it, we're consulting, we're listening. And so that's the first thing. We'll have some further research, particularly as we dig deeper into land reform, its history, its problems in the United States, and social benefit enterprise, some further analysis on that. And then we'll change and adapt. Secondly, we'll build a Green New Deal and forest grassroots network. A lot of people have expressed support and enthusiasm for the ideas contained in this. And I'll just note Sunrise Movement Principle for Action number 10. We unite with other movements for change to abolish or reimagine institutions that degrade our communities and our climate. Notice the level of charge there. Abolish or reimagine institutions. This isn't pablum. This is not, the climate crisis is not calling for, we're going to make Weyerhaeuser better. It's calling for a change in the institutions because they are incapable of doing what needs to be done in a just and fair transition. And what can you do? I would strongly suggest downloading from coastrange.org, as Andrew indicated, the document. It's right there. It might not be an easy read, but hopefully it's a good read. And you can volunteer, sponsor, or support a local Green New Deal webinar like this one locally. If it was small enough, everyone could be on the screen and talking. And if you have any questions or want to get involved or anything, write Lacey at coastrange.org, throw questions, whatever. And thank you. I'm done. It's time for joy.